Hello everyone and welcome back. This is going to be part 4 of this kind of video lecture series in which I'm finishing off the topic on the crisis of Parliament and the outbreak of civil war. In previous lectures we have covered the chronology and dealt with the events and the issues that happen in 1640 to 1642 leading to this outbreak of civil war in August of 1642 that year. What we're going to do in this lecture is something slightly different. We're now going to reflect on what we've covered, and we're going to deal with it in a little bit more of a thematic kind of way. So we've done the chronology, we're ending there with that. Going into this lecture, I expect you to know what happens in the previous 3. It won't make any sense at all if you haven't seen the previous 3 lectures. So make sure you've seen all of those and that you understand them before moving on to this one. This lecture is going to deal with the theme, and it's going to deal with the theme of why there is a formation of sides. Okay, so as I said at the start, our key question in this topic is what was the main reason for the formation of sides between 1640 and 1642? What we're going to do in this one is try and actually answer that question. So we're going to reflect on what we've covered, considering the events of the years 1640 to 42, and consider what is the main reason for the formation of sides in those years. What we're going to do is go through each of our key factors, our 4 factors, which you should remember at this point being the untrustworthiness of Charles, the radicalism of Pym, the religious divisions, and events outside of Parliament in London, Ireland and Scotland. We're going to go through each of those one by one, considering at each moment how important that factor is in leading to the formation of sides through this period. As always, what I recommend is making notes as you go. This will replace the notes you've made in class, and this one will be particularly useful for thinking about kind of moving on to thinking about the main factor and really analysing the events and thinking about why the events are important. So this one is going to be, not so much description of events, but more the analysis of them and the analysis of their significance. Okay, let's dive into it. So why are we so concerned about the formation of sides? That's going to be our first kind of question. Before we get into looking at these 4 factors, we need to know why are we actually looking at the formation of sides in this topic? Why is it so important? Why have I kind of led this as the key question in this topic? Well, civil wars are wars fought between citizens of the same country. Okay, so civil wars are always internal conflicts between citizens of the same country. Civil wars are often, in many cases, more violent because of that. If you look at civil wars in China, in Syria, in the modern world, in England during this time, these wars are often more violent because they're so heartfelt. It takes a lot of anger and a lot of concern to raise arms against fellow countrymen. So civil wars are fought between members of the same country. They're often more violent. So in order to understand why a civil war broke out, we have to understand why 2 sides felt so strongly that they were willing to fight violently against one another. Why is it that we get to a point in August 1642 that these 2 sides that are going to be the royalists and the parliamentarians feel so strongly about this issue that they are willing to go to war with one another in order to resolve that conflict? The peaceful debate through word forms, through kind of consensus is over, and now they're turning to military means to try and deal with the issues. So what we need to understand is, in order to understand why a civil war breaks out, we have to understand why 2 sides are willing to fight one another in their own country over the issues that they're concerned about. So when we're thinking about why does a civil war break out, well, really what we're trying to ask is why do two sides form? What was the most important event? What was the most important theme? And just to remind you and give you the broad overview, in 1640, I'm going to do a kind of a diagram here. It might be worth making notes on this once I've finished it. In 1640, we have a united parliament. The political nation, the group of people who are involved in politics at this time, are largely in agreement that they want to deal with Charles's wrongs during personal rule. They want to deal with the issues relating to finances, religion, law and order, etc. Okay, they want to deal with those issues. Then Parliament divides over attitudes to Charles, to religion, to Pym's radicalism, and events in London. And we have these two kind of very loose but definitely distinct sides in Parliament. We have the constitutional royalists, the moderates, those who are kind of on Charles's side and willing to accept the reforms that he's offered and quite content with those. Whereas on the other hand, we have Pym's junto, the radicals, who are pushing for more and more concessions. They want further reforms and they want, further kind of constraints on Charles's powers. So what is the main thing that causes those divisions? Really, that's the issue that leads to civil war. Because what we then see is the two sides consolidate, they harden their views over this period, and they become really two very distinct kind of parties and sides. And then war breaks out. And by the time war breaks out in August 1642, you have very distinctly your royalists, who are known as your cavaliers, okay, and then you have your parliamentarians, the Roundheads. So again, what we need to consider when thinking about why civil war breaks out is really, why is there a formation of sides? Why do two sides form, and why are they so willing to fight this civil war against one another by the end of 1642? So now what we're going to do is deal with each of those four main factors one by one. We're going to start off by looking at the untrustworthiness of Charles, then we'll move on to the other ones. What I'll do is I'll present on each slide the kind of main reasons why each factor is important, and then at the end I'll give you a chance to reflect on what you think is the most important. Before I get into it, it's probably worth saying that I've kind of ordered these in probably the way I think they're most significant. So I think the untrustworthiness of Charles is the most important reason, and that's followed then by what we'll deal with in the next slide and then the slide after that. Okay, so let's deal with the untrustworthiness of Charles first of all, and the impact this has on the formation of sides. I think it's useful to start off with this quote from Barry Coward, who notes that Charles' stubborn, uncompromising and sometimes shifty behaviour continued to ensure political suspicions about the intentions of the king and those around him. Those of you who've been taught by me obviously know at this point that Charles, I don't think Charles is particularly successful as a monarch and particularly able as a political operator. So it won't be particularly unusual that I'm going to bash Charles a little bit here, but here we go. So we know that Charles is stubborn and uncompromising. What we mean by that is that he very rarely accepts any limitations on his prerogative powers. He believes very strongly that he has been appointed by God to rule his kingdoms, and that anyone who opposes him is going against God's word in doing so. So he's got this very rigid way of looking at the world. He thinks if people don't accept his authority, they're going against him and by implication God. So he is an uncompromising king. To give him some credit, he does do some reforms during this time, but nevertheless there are still suspicions about him, and that's largely because of his shifty behaviour, and this leads to concerns about his intentions, what he wants to achieve. So what's his shifty behaviour? Well, to give you the long view of this, we know that Charles sometimes says things and goes back on his word. He's done this in his early reign. He accepted the for instance, the Petition of Right in 1628, and then simply ignored it and carried on collecting taxes, for instance, against Parliament's consent. We also know during this time he's conducted various things that are very shifty. The incident, for instance, in Scotland, where he tries to arrest leading Covenanters. And all of this leads to concerns about what his intentions are. What does he want to achieve, and what is he trying to do? He never lays this out clearly, so people are concerned about what he's really trying to achieve. People don't trust Charles's intentions. His actions seem to suggest he was an absolutist at heart. And what that means is that he believed in a political system where there was no parliament, where there were no constraints on monarchical power, where he was an absolute king and he had absolute, complete power. Okay, so people believe that, and there are concerns about that. People had concerns too about his religious leanings. Arminianism, Charles's favoured form of Christianity, looked very similar to Catholicism for most people. Remember, Arminianism involved reintroducing altars, giving bishops more authority, placing an emphasis on ceremony. All of those things were quite similar to Catholic practices. And this fear that Charles was really kind of leading the church back towards Catholicism, combined with this fear about his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, who at this time was practicing mass at court. She had her own Catholic entourage at court. And there were concerns that she was influencing Charles to lead England back to a Catholic way of doing things. There were real concerns about this, because the last time England had a Catholic monarch, that was Mary I. And Mary I was probably most known as being Bloody Mary for killing 300 Protestants and burning them at the stake. So there were real concerns about this during this time. So people are worried about Charles's political leanings, and that he might be an absolutist, might be trying to get rid of Parliament, and his religious leanings too. What this means is that people don't trust him. The consequence of that is that mistrust of Charles was the key reason why MPs were willing to accept radical measures, such as the execution of Strafford, the Grand Remonstrance, and the Militia Bill. So it was Charles's untrustworthiness that led to this reaction by MPs, where they were swinging towards these more radical things, because they didn't trust Charles to stick with the more moderate reforms that had already been passed. So they wanted further, more radical measures, such as taking control of the army in the Militia Bill, or by gaining control of aspects of religion in the Grand Remonstrance, or by getting rid of Charles's advisors in the execution of Strafford. So really, the issue of radicalism stems right back to Charles. It was Charles's fault radicalism developed, because people couldn't trust him. And to make matters worse, of course, probably the most important of our key events in this time is Charles's attempted arrest. He confirmed in that attempted arrest, where he marches into the House of Commons and tries to arrest 5 leading MPs, including Pym, that he is an untrustworthy king, and that is the first opportunity he will use military force to subdue opponents in Parliament. So the untrustworthiness of Charles is a key factor in leading to the division of sides, because it makes parliamentarians more radical and more willing to take those radical measures to limit Charles's powers, and that leads to this moderate and radical split. Okay, so I personally think that's probably the most significant factor here, but we're going to deal with the following ones, and you can judge them at the end for your own purposes. Next one that is also very significant is the radicalism of Pym. So we know a lot about John Pym at this point. He's your leading parliamentarian really during this time, and he has a group in Parliament known as Pym's Junto, or kind of group. So the reversal of Charles's personal rule measures satisfied everyone, but Pym's junto wanted further concessions, both in religion and politics. So again, they wanted further reforms to the religious way of doing things and also to the political sphere. If you're making this argument that Pym's radicalism was the main reason, you would say that Pym's radicalism broke Parliament's unity between constitutional royalists and radicals. For many, the reforms that Pym was demanding were too extreme, and this led to this conservative, this traditional reaction to what Pym was suggesting. And this therefore split Parliament because some people agreed with Pym's radical measures and some people didn't. And it was his radicalism that then split Parliament between these two sides. So Pym sparked this conservative reaction by doing the following. He used the London mob. So we've seen, for instance, in the execution of Strafford, Pym was willing to call on ordinary people to take to the streets to put pressure on political leaders and operators. So he put pressure on Charles to sign the execution warrant by using the London mob, and also used the London mob to put pressure on the House of Lords to pass that execution as well. So Pym is not afraid of using the London mob. The Conservatives reacted to this by doing things and suggesting things such as suggesting that well, actually the mob should not be a political force during this time. England's not a democracy. Ordinary people aren't involved in politics, and Pym's willingness to turn to the London mob for many Conservatives raised concerns about order and property, and raised concerns that people were threatening social stability and order. There was fears about kind of the whole world kind of turning on its head and ordinary people rising up against the social hierarchy that was very well established. So many MPs were concerned about things like the London mob, and Pym was willing to use that, and that shows his radicalness. Pym also shows his radicalness and caused the Conservative reaction by pushing for the execution of Strafford. He wanted to deal with Strafford because of concerns about Strafford's efficiency, and this led to many MPs actually voting against it, and many MPs decided actually that he'd gone too far, but were concerned that they didn't actually end up voting in that, so they couldn't be responsible for what happened next. So real concerns about what Pym was doing here. Pym also caused a Conservative reaction by encouraging further political reforms. So in the 10 propositions, he suggested that, for instance, Charles's children should be educated by Parliament. In the Grand Remonstrance, Pym recommended that aspects of religion should be controlled by Parliament, a challenge to the royal prerogative. And in the Militia Bill, Pym suggested that the army should be controlled, in a sense, by Parliament. For most people in Parliament, or for many, I'd say probably about half, all of these three things were too extreme. They were too extreme largely because they challenged the royal prerogative to such an extreme degree. And these things simply weren't acceptable. They didn't symbolise a traditional constitution. They represented a new and reformed constitution. And remember, when we're thinking about the word radical, what we mean is someone who wants extensive changes to something. And these three things show that Pym wanted that. And this caused that Conservative reaction that split Parliament between those two sides. Pym also pushed for religious reforms. So, for instance, in December, he pushed for the Bishops' Exclusion Bill, which suggested that bishops should be removed from the House of Lords. This would have, again, challenged Charles's royal prerogative, his royal rights, his royal powers, because he had the power to appoint bishops, and that was a key part of his prerogative powers. So for many people, Pym's radicalism was too far, and this caused a traditional reaction against these types of things. I think it's a convincing argument to say Pym's radicalism was a very significant factor during this time in splitting Parliament. Let's move on to religious divisions now, our third main reason. So just to remind you, I've got a little kind of chart here on the right hand side. Those of you who have been taught by me will have known this chart and seen it before. I showed you at the very start of the course. Really the chart is about explaining differences in religion during this time. So we have high church at the top. The high church aspect of religion is something that emphasizes ritual and the authority of bishops. Ceremonies, things like mass are top-down in structure. At the bottom down here, what we have is a low church way of doing things. So a low church is a church that does not emphasize the authority of bishops, usually doesn't have bishops, or rituals and ceremonies. So it doesn't place emphasis on those things. Congregations are decentralized, they're bottom up. They usually focus on sermons rather than religious rituals and ceremonies. A Puritan, to remind you, is now on the bottom here. They are a group who seek to eradicate all traces of the Catholic Church from the Church of England. Their name is to purify, to eradicate Catholicism. And Presbyterianism as well. That's the group who don't believe there should be a structure, a hierarchy in the church, so there shouldn't be any bishops. Okay, so I'm just going to deal a little bit with the definitions just to remind ourselves of religion, because it's a little bit of a complicated thing at this time, but it's very important because religion is essentially intertwined with politics. So what we see on this chart is the different monarchs through this period and through the period just before our course. So they're in order. Okay, we have the medieval era up here where every monarch was Catholic. We have Henry VIII, who broke from Catholicism. We then have Mary, who restored. We have Edward, who down here went more towards a more low church form of Protestantism. We then have Mary, who restored Catholic aspects. We have Elizabeth, who established the middle path with traces of Catholicism and Puritanism. James carried that policy on. Okay, and then we have Charles, who swung right back up here up to Arminianism. Now I'm just going to first of all go through a couple of concepts. So Catholics, who are they? What do they believe in? Well, Catholics, also known as Roman Catholics, believe the Pope is the governor of the church. Okay, so the Pope is at the top of the church structure. There's an emphasis on rituals such as Mass. Okay, so there's an emphasis on kind of performing religiosity as an important part of the practice. They have a clear hierarchy involving bishops. And they also have a cycle of forgiveness. And what that is about achieving salvation, so achieving kind of acceptance. And that's about this kind of cycle of forgiveness where if a sin occurs, you repent, and then you achieve penance. Okay, so there's a real emphasis on performing religious actions and doing things in a very active physical way in the Catholic side of things up here, and all of that involves bishops. So in order to confess your sins, you need to go to a church, a member of the church hierarchy, and do that confession. So that's why there's an emphasis on these ceremonies, rituals, and hierarchy up here at the top. Now, what we have here is Charles's form of religion, which was Arminianism. And remember, that's the kind of ideas of Laudianism, what he introduced into the church. That restored the Church of England to many kind of Catholic ways of doing things. So it reintroduced, for instance, altars and ceremony. And it looked like England was going towards Catholicism to a higher degree. Okay, now down here at the bottom, let's deal with Puritanism. So Puritans are a group who essentially, they're a loose group, and there's a range of ideas. There's a range of these ideas here that get a little bit more complicated as the course develops. But generally, what unites them is a couple of things. Firstly, that they seek to eradicate traces of Catholicism. So they don't want bishops, they don't want altars, all of these types of things. They believed in predestination, which again was a difference between the Catholic way of achieving salvation. Predestination is the idea that you achieve salvation if you're predetermined. A select group have been predestined, the elect, they're known as, have been predestined, chosen by God to achieve salvation. So it's a very different way of looking at it. That means that the church is less important, because you don't need to go to church and necessarily confess to sins. They also believed that there should be an emphasis on sermons. So religious or actions in church should be more about moral issues. There shouldn't be as much ceremony. Okay, so you've got a real split. The Elizabethan settlement was right in the middle here. Okay, so it was the middle path. It was known as the Via Media, the middle path. So there were traces of Catholicism and Puritanism. So there was there was bishops in the church, but there was also this kind of belief in predestination. Okay, so there was a mixture. To some extent, it was relatively tolerant and open. Charles made it more restrictive by introducing this, Arminianism, which angered the Puritans because it looked like Catholicism was being reintroduced. Okay, so that's a quick overview. Just to remind you of what the churches look like. Here is an example of a high and low church. A high church, a little bit confusing, I suppose, at the bottom. And then a low church at the top. So you can see they look very different. The high church is grander, more extravagant, symbol of power and wealth. The low church is very much more basic and plain. Okay, all right. Let's deal a little bit with why there's religious divisions in this time. Then now we've done the background on the terminology and the language. So Parliament is split between two religious groups during this time. So you're split between the constitutional royalists and the radicals, and they both have different religious ideas and leanings. The constitutional royalists are moderate Anglicans. Okay, so on our chart, they would be the people who believe in the Elizabethan settlement, in the middle here. Okay, Charles abandons Laudianism in this period, and he abandons Laud as well, who's in the Tower of London under arrest. But he abandons Laudianism as well. So we're thinking about the constitutional royalists as moderate Anglicans here in the middle, in the Via Media. Oops. Okay, so they sought to maintain a balance between Catholic and Calvinist traits. The Via Media, they want to re-establish what they had in kind of before 25, I suppose. The radicals, on the other hand, wanted further reforms, further changes to the church. And this is what really split, this was the driving force, I suppose, between what split the two sides. So the radicals were Puritans. And remember, Puritans want to get rid of the Catholic traits. So they sought to remove Catholic traits from the church, and specifically bishops at this time, because what they had experienced during personal rule is that the bishops were the ones who were promoting Arminianism. And if you're going to get rid of Arminianism, well, the best way of doing that is by getting rid of the bishops who introduced Arminianism and establishing a more low church way of doing things. So that's why they took this approach. So radicals pushed for religious reform in bills that were particularly controversial, and this really did split Parliament. The first of those bills was the Root and Branch Bill, which you'll remember was initially a petition signed by 15,000 Londoners in the latter part of 1640. It then turned into a bill in August 1641 and was voted on in Parliament. The bill essentially proposed that bishops were to be removed, and it passed the House of Commons just, and I think those numbers there illustrate how divided Parliament was. So the 139 in favour, the 108 against. Okay, so that shows how divided the House of Commons was over that issue of removing bishops. The Puritans, the radicals, wanted to remove bishops because they were the ones who introduced Arminianism, and they were symbols of Catholicism, whereas the constitutional royalists thought, bishops were there in the Elizabethan settlement, they should remain there as well moving forward. And they also thought that challenging them was a challenge to the royal prerogative, to Charles, and they didn't accept that. That bill was never passed because it didn't go to the House of Lords after that vote in the House of Commons, because the bishops were sitting in the House of Lords and they certainly would have opposed it. So that illustrates that Parliament is very much split over that issue of religion. Okay, and furthermore, the second issue that splits Parliament is the Bishops' Exclusion Bill in December 1641. The House of Commons in December 1641 voted to exclude bishops from the House of Lords. They again knew at this point that the House of Lords wouldn't accept because there are bishops there, and as always, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, so they wouldn't vote for their own abolition. So that wasn't passed in the House of Lords, but nevertheless, that shows this tension between the two houses and within Parliament, and that really does help consolidate these two sides here over this issue of religion. So that's to say religion plays an important role in splitting Parliament. You've got the Puritans and the Radicals and the Constitutional Royalists. Okay, final main reason now, events outside of Parliament in London, Ireland and Scotland. We'll deal with them one by one. So events outside of Parliament helped to consolidate the formation of sides. It was really the thing that helped to kind of, I suppose, make the two sides more rigid and less loose in their composition. Events in London, first of all. So this is obviously the London mob. Popular radicalism in the London mob scared many conservative-minded MPs. As we've said, conservative-minded MPs were concerned about the manner in which the radicals are willing to use the London mob, and they were concerned about threats to law and order and stability. And this image up here shows one of Charles's colonels, Colonel Lunford. It says he's assaulting the Londoners at Westminster Hall. And basically this is Charles's attempt to re-establish order in December 1641, because he recognised how important that was for the constitutional royalists. Whereas remember, the radicals were willing to use the London mob. Pym, for instance, uses the Grand Remonstrance and publishes it to the people to get them on side, basically. So there was divisions over those events, and the constitutional royalists and radicals reacted in different ways. We also have splits over events in Scotland. So the incident is the main one, which confirmed many fears that MPs had about Charles. So the issue mainly is about how to trust Charles when he's trying to arrest leading Covenanters in Scotland. Different MPs obviously take different views. The constitutional royalists are more willing to trust Charles, whereas the radicals are less willing to trust Charles. And then events in Ireland, lastly. So the Irish Rebellion, as we said, raised questions about Charles's trustworthiness with an army. For the radicals, he couldn't be trusted. For the constitutional royalists, he should be. And his religious inclinations. For the radicals, for the Puritans, Charles looked very much like a Catholic. So would he support the Catholics in their revolt? That was a question people had. Whereas for the constitutional royalists, Charles had given up on Armenianism at this point and should be trusted to put down the Irish revolt. So I think really this fact is probably least significant, but it does help to consolidate and also to escalate some of the issues. Some of these issues lead and kind of force MPs to take a side. So for instance, when the Irish revolt happens, you have the militia bill that leads from that, and then at that point people are forced to vote. Are they going to vote for Charles controlling the army or for Parliament controlling the army? So it kind of it forces them to take a side in that sense, and that's probably the significance of this. I think the two sides are probably already formed by this point, but this helps to make them more rigid. Overall, these events, as I've said, forced MPs to choose a side. Okay, so that's a summary of the kind of four factors. And really, I haven't got a whole lot else to say on this one. At this point, you can come up with your own judgments. Again, I think it's largely in that order that I've gone through. So it's probably, in terms of most to least significant, it's probably Charles's trustworthiness or untrustworthiness, the radicalism of Pym, followed by religion, and followed by events outside of Parliament. Probably in that order as to what I think is most and least significant. Just as a final task for you to do on this, to summarise the themes and draw them together, what I want you to do is go to the bottom of my notes. I should have sent my notes in the email alongside this lecture. If I haven't, do remind me, because I'm obviously recording this a little bit before I send the email out. Nevertheless, I should have attached my notes on the topic. What I want you to do now is go to the bottom of my notes, and there is a summary task for you to complete. It gets you thinking about what you think is the main reason for the formation of sides, and gets you to kind of plot some evidence on those different arguments. And it'll help you consolidate it a little further. Okay, so that's what I recommend doing now. I'm going to set it for homework, and I'm going to want a photo of it sent to me via email by the specified date that I say in the email that I send you. Okay, once again, thanks very much, everybody. Any questions, do let me know.